Neri stood in the observation deck of the research vessel Cosmic Inquiry *, her small 3-foot frame barely reaching the control panel. She adjusted it downward, a common accommodation for Mesonians aboard interspecies vessels. The stars stretched before her, beautiful and calming, but they did little to settle her nerves today. Their ship was about to make contact with a human diplomatic vessel for the first time in the mission. "You've been checking the docking schedule every hour," said her colleague Mino, his light blue skin contrasting with Neri's deeper azure tone. "The human won't arrive any faster because you worry." "I'm not worried," Neri lied, her large eyes blinking rapidly. "I'm preparing." "There's a difference." Mino's antennae twitched with amusement. "You've read the human cultural briefing packet 6 times. I think you're prepared." Neri clutched her datapad tighter. The briefing had only made things worse. Humans stood over 6 feet tall on average, giants compared to Mesonians. They had dense muscle mass, endoskeletons that couldn't be compacted, and worst of all, confusing social behaviors. The section on human mating practices had been particularly alarming, full of warnings about their tendency to form quick attachments and misinterpret friendly gestures from other species. "Did you know," Neri whispered, "that humans sometimes choose mates after just a few meetings? And they use eye contact as a primary mating signal." "Those reports are exaggerated," Mino said, waving a slender hand dismissively. "The Galactic Council would hardly allow them to join if they were that primitive." Captain Tai entered the observation deck, his tall Mesonian frame making him nearly 4 feet tall, impressive for their species. "Dr. Neri, Dr. Mino, good. I need our best scientists present when the human arrives. We want to make a good impression." Neri swallowed hard. "Captain, perhaps Dr. G would be better suited. Her research in comparative physiology." "Your work on interspecies communication is why you're here," Captain Tai interrupted. "The human diplomat is named Kim. He will be joining our research mission for the next 60 cycles. You'll be working closely with him." Neri's stomach dropped. "Working closely? But my laboratory is quite small, and the human has been assigned the connecting lab to yours. The Council feels your projects have natural overlap." The captain checked his wrist device. "The docking procedure begins in 20 minutes. Please report to the main airlock." After he left, Neri turned to Mino in panic. "The connecting lab, with the shared storage room. I'll be trapped with him." "Humans aren't predators," Mino said, but his antennae had flattened slightly, betraying his own unease. "They're just enthusiastic and loud." The briefing said they require constant social interaction and physical contact to maintain mental health, Neri said, her voice rising. "What if this Kim tries to mate with me?" "Don't be ridiculous," Mino replied. "Humans may be strange, but they know basic biological incompatibility." "But what if he doesn't care? What if he finds me exotic?" Neri's mind raced with the terrible stories she'd heard. Humans collecting alien artifacts, humans falling in love with bizarre things, humans with their confusing concept of finding differences attractive. The ship's announcement system chimed softly. "Attention all crew. Human diplomatic vessel approaching docking bay. Designated greeting personnel report to main airlock." Neri smoothed down her science uniform and tried to calm her breathing. She was being silly. She was a respected xenocommunication expert. She had 3 advanced degrees. She would not be intimidated by one large, possibly mate-seeking alien. The main airlock was crowded with senior staff. Captain Ta stood at the front, with various department heads forming a small reception line. Neri and Mino took their places, representing the science division. "Remember," Captain Ta said quietly, "this human is an important diplomat. The success of this joint research mission could open new opportunities for Mesonian science throughout human space." The airlock cycled with a series of clicks and hisses. Neri held her breath as the door slowly opened. The human had to duck to enter. He unfolded to his full height. easily twice Neri's size, and smiled, showing flat, blunt teeth. His skin was a light brown, his hair black, and cropped short. He wore a blue uniform with silver trim that Neri recognized as the human diplomatic corps standard. "Greetings to the crew of the Cosmic Inquiry *," the human said, his voice deeper than any Mesonian's. "I am Diplomat Kim. Thank you for welcoming me aboard your magnificent vessel." Captain Ta stepped forward to perform the traditional Mesonian greeting, pressing his palm briefly against his chest. "Welcome, Diplomat Kim. I am Captain Ta. Allow me to introduce my senior staff." The introductions moved down the line. Neri felt her hearts racing as the human approached. When he reached her, his gaze fixed directly on her face, the first warning sign of human mating interest, according to the briefing. "This is Dr. Neri, our xenocommunication specialist," Captain Ta said. "She will be your primary scientific liaison during your stay." The human smiled even wider and extended his hand, a giant appendage that could easily envelop Neri's entire arm. "Dr. Neri, I've read your paper on cross-species metaphor translation. Brilliant work." Neri froze, staring at the outstretched hand. The briefing had mentioned this gesture, handshaking, a physical contact ritual with complex social rules. If she refused, she might cause diplomatic offense. If she accepted, the human might interpret it as receptiveness to further contact. "Thank you," she managed, extending her much smaller hand tentatively. The human's grip was gentle but firm, enveloping her hand completely. His skin was warm, too warm, like he had a fever. Neri knew intellectually this was normal human body temperature, but the sensation was alarming. "I look forward to working with you," Kim said, looking directly into her eyes again. "I have many questions about your communication theories." Neri withdrew her hand as quickly as politeness allowed. "Yes, of course. Questions. Scientific questions. I would be happy to discuss. Science." The human's expression changed slightly. What did that mean? Was he disappointed by her formality? Was he planning a more direct approach later? As Captain Ta led Diplomat Kim on a tour of the ship, Neri whispered urgently to Mino, "Did you see how he looked at me? And he's read my research." "That's called professional interest," Mino replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "He'll be right next to my lab," Neri said. "What if he comes over all the time with questions? What if that's just an excuse?" Later that night, Neri couldn't sleep. She pulled up the human briefing again, scanning for information she might have missed. There had to be some way to clearly signal non-interest without causing offense. The diplomatic mission was too important to risk, but so was her peace of mind. Tomorrow, she would face the human again. She would be professional but distant. She would establish clear boundaries. She would not, under any circumstances, be alone with Diplomat Kim. What Neri didn't know was that Diplomat Kim was equally nervous about working with the tiny Mesonians, terrified of accidentally hurting them with his much larger frame, and had spent hours practicing gentle handshakes before arrival. 3 days had passed since Diplomat Kim joined the Cosmic Inquiry *, and Neri's fears had only grown stronger. Each interaction with the human seemed to confirm her suspicions that he had singled her out for his attentions. The morning began like any other. Neri arrived at her laboratory early, hoping to complete some work before the human appeared. Her small hands moved quickly over the communication analysis equipment, adjusting settings designed for her 3-foot height. "Good morning, Dr. Neri." The booming voice made her jump. Kim stood in the doorway between their connecting labs, a container in each hand. He had to bend slightly to fit through the Mesonian-sized opening. "I brought coffee," he said, smiling broadly. "I noticed you work early too." Neri's antennae flattened against her head in alarm. The human was bringing her food, a classic courtship gesture in many species. She had read about this coffee in the briefing. Humans used it for heightened alertness, but also as a social bonding ritual. "Thank you," she said stiffly, not moving to take the offered drink. But Mesonians don't consume stimulants before midday. Oh, I didn't know that. Kim placed one container on a nearby table. It's here if you change your mind. May I ask what you're working on? He moved closer, leaning down to see her display. Neri stepped back quickly, bumping into her chair. Just routine analysis, she said, her voice higher than normal. Nothing interesting. Your work is always interesting, Kim replied, his eyes fixed on her face again. I've been studying your translation protocols since I arrived. The way you map emotional concepts across species is revolutionary. Neri felt trapped. He was complimenting her research, another warning sign from the briefing. Humans often expressed mating interest through praise of professional accomplishments. The translation matrix was a team effort, she said, edging toward the door. I should check with Dr. Mino about our shared project. Before you go, Kim said, reaching up to a shelf above her workspace, I noticed you were struggling to reach this yesterday. He easily plucked down a specimen container that had indeed been frustratingly out of her reach. As he handed it to her, their fingers briefly touched. Neri nearly dropped the container. I can help with high shelves anytime, he offered, still smiling. Just ask. Thank you, Neri said, clutching the container to her chest. I need to go now. She hurried from the lab, heart pounding. This was exactly what the briefing had warned about. Humans showing off their physical capabilities, creating situations where they could be helpful, engineering casual physical contact. Neri found Mino in the ship's cafeteria, his blue face concerned as she explained what had happened. He's always watching me, she whispered, glancing around to make sure the human wasn't nearby. Yesterday he saved me a seat in the staff meeting, marking territory, just like the briefing said. And now he's bringing me drinks. Perhaps he's just being friendly, Mino suggested, though his antennae twitched doubtfully. The briefing said they always claim that, Neri countered. They disguise mating pursuits as friendliness until it's too late. Later that day, Neri was in the specimen storage room when she heard heavy footsteps. Before she could escape, Kim appeared in the doorway, blocking her exit. There you are, he said. I was hoping to catch you. I had a question about your communication theory. Neri backed against the shelves. Perhaps you could send it in a message. It's easier to explain in person. I'm having trouble understanding how your translation matrix accounts for species with completely different sensory systems. This sounded like a legitimate scientific question, but Neri remained suspicious. The human had cornered her in a small space. Another warning sign. Different sensory frameworks require a metamorphic approach to concept mapping, she said quickly. I really must go now. Kim looked confused but stepped aside. As Neri squeezed past him, she noticed how he seemed to make himself smaller, hunching his shoulders and pressing against the wall to give her more space. That evening, Captain Ta called Neri to his office. Is everything all right, Doctor? Diplomat Kim mentioned you seem uncomfortable around him. Neri's antennae shot up in surprise. He noticed. He's concerned he's done something to offend you, the captain said. This mission requires good working relationships. If there's a problem, we should address it. No problem, Neri said quickly. Humans are just very large. Captain Ta studied her. Remember, this is an important diplomatic opportunity. Please make an effort. The next morning, Neri forced herself to enter the shared storage area when she knew Kim would be there. She would be professional, as the captain requested. Good morning, Diplomat Kim, she said formally. I need to access the communication archives. Of course, he replied, moving away from the section she needed to reach. I've been organizing the higher shelves. I thought it might help. Neri looked up and saw that he had indeed rearranged items, putting Mesonian-relevant materials on lower shelves within her reach. Was this thoughtful organization or another excuse to help her? Thank you, she said cautiously. I also adjusted the voice recognition in the shared system to better detect Mesonian speech patterns. Kim added, I noticed it was missing your commands about 20% of the time. This was genuinely helpful. Neri felt conflicted. That's very considerate. It's the least I could do, Kim said. You've been very patient despite my presence clearly making you uncomfortable. Nari blinked in surprise. The human was acknowledging her discomfort. The briefing hadn't mentioned this possibility. I'm not uncomfortable, she lied. I'm just cautious. I understand, Kim said, nodding. I must seem very alien to you. Before Nari could respond, the ship's alarm system activated. Warning: atmospheric anomaly detected in laboratory section C. All personnel evacuate immediately. Neri froze. That was their section. We need to go, Kim said, his voice suddenly serious. As they hurried toward the exit, a loud bang echoed from the lab area, followed by hissing. The ship's computer spoke again. Containment breach in laboratory section C, sealing affected areas. The storage room door began to close automatically. Kim reacted instantly, wedging his large body in the doorway. Go, he shouted to Nari. I'll hold it. Nari hesitated only a moment before darting under his arm and through the gap. As she cleared the doorway, she heard Kim grunt with effort as he squeezed through just before the door sealed completely. In the corridor, emergency systems were already activating, filtering the air. Kim looked down at Nari with concern. Are you all right? Nari nodded, still processing what had happened. The human had put himself at risk to ensure her escape. According to the briefing, humans often performed heroic acts to impress potential mates, but this had seemed genuinely selfless. As they joined other evacuating crew members, Neri found herself confused. Either the human was very dedicated to his pursuit, or perhaps, just perhaps, she had misinterpreted his gestures after all. The Cosmic Inquiry glided through space, its systems humming quietly as most of the crew slept during the night cycle. Nari wasn't sleeping. She had stayed late in her laboratory, running tests on a new communication protocol. The evacuation from last week's containment breach had set her research back, and she was determined to catch up. Computer, analyze translation pattern Delta 9, she instructed, her small fingers moving across the control panel. A soft chime indicated the computer had accepted her command. Nari yawned and stretched her arms above her head. The lab felt peaceful without the looming presence of Diplomat Kim. Despite his helpful actions during the evacuation, she remained wary of his intentions. The peace shattered as the emergency alert sounded, a piercing wail that made Nari's antennae vibrate painfully. Warning: containment failure in xenobiology. Hazardous specimen release detected. Emergency lockdown initiating in affected sections. Nari's heart raced. Her lab was 2 doors down from xenobiology. She rushed to the exit, but the door had already sealed. The computer's voice continued with terrifying calmness. Biohazard detected in laboratory section C. Oxygen levels will be reduced to suppress specimen activity. All personnel evacuate immediately. Nari slapped the emergency override panel. Nothing happened. She tried her communication badge next. This is Dr. Nari in Lab C3. I'm trapped inside during lockdown. Please respond. Static answered her. The communications were already affected. Nari looked around frantically. The air vents were closing. Soon the oxygen would be reduced to levels that would keep the escaped specimen dormant, but those same levels would be dangerous for her Mesonian physiology. Through the small window in her lab door, Nari could see a faint greenish mist beginning to seep under the door from the hallway. The specimen was an oxygen-reactive fungal culture that could grow explosively in the right conditions. If it reached her, its microscopic spores could cause severe respiratory damage. Help, she called, knowing it was futile. The night shift was minimal, and the emergency protocols would have sealed off the entire section. Nari climbed onto her desk to reach the emergency supply cabinet. Inside was a breathing mask, but it was designed for larger species and would never seal properly around her small face. She tried anyway, pressing it against her mouth as the green mist began to fill the lower part of the lab. A loud bang startled her. Someone was at the observation window in the hallway. Through the spreading mist, she saw a large figure, Diplomat Kim. He was wearing an emergency breather mask and pointing urgently at the door controls on her side. "The manual override," he shouted, his voice muffled by the mask and the thick door. "Press the red and blue buttons simultaneously." Nari jumped down, careful to stay on her desk above the gathering mist. She stretched to reach the control panel, but it was mounted for taller species. Even standing on tiptoe, she couldn't quite reach the top buttons. Outside, Kim was working on the hall controls, but the emergency lockdown had disabled them. He disappeared from the window briefly, then returned with what looked like a maintenance tool. He began prying at the door mechanism. The mist was rising faster now. Nari could feel her lungs burning as trace amounts leaked through her ill-fitting mask. Her vision began to blur at the edges. With a desperate leap, she managed to hit the manual override buttons, but landed in the mist. She coughed violently as the spores entered her lungs. The door slid open a few inches before jamming. Kim's large hands appeared in the gap, pushing with tremendous force. Metal groaned as he forced the door open wide enough to enter. Without hesitation, he waded through the knee-high mist, lifted Nari in his arms, and carried her out. In the hallway, he sealed his mask over her face despite her weak protests. "Deep breaths," he instructed, moving quickly toward the emergency decontamination chamber at the end of the corridor. Inside the chamber, automated systems activated, spraying them both with a fine mist of neutralizing agent. Kim set Nari down carefully on a bench, but kept a steadying hand on her shoulder as she coughed and gasped. "Medical team is on the way," he said. "Just breathe slowly." When Nari could finally speak, she looked up at Kim with newfound confusion. "Why were you here?" "It's the middle of night cycle. I was checking on a culture sample in xenobiology," he explained. "I heard the alarm and was evacuating when I realized you might still be in your lab. You often work late." "You noticed my schedule?" Nari asked suspiciously, old fears resurfacing despite his heroic actions. The peace shattered as the emergency alert sounded, a piercing wail that made Nari's antennae vibrate painfully. "Warning. Containment failure in xenobiology. Hazardous specimen release detected. Emergency lockdown initiating in affected sections." Nari's heart raced. Her lab was 2 doors down from xenobiology. She rushed to the exit, but the door had already sealed. The computer's voice continued with terrifying calmness. "Biohazard detected in laboratory section C. Oxygen levels will be reduced to suppress specimen activity. All personnel evacuate immediately." Nari slapped the emergency override panel. Nothing happened. She tried her communication badge next. "This is Dr. Nari in Lab C3. I'm trapped inside during lockdown. Please respond." Static answered her. The communications were already affected. Nari looked around frantically. The air vents were closing. Soon the oxygen would be reduced to levels that would keep the escaped specimen dormant, but those same levels would be dangerous for her Mesonian physiology. Through the small window in her lab door, Nari could see a faint greenish mist beginning to seep under the door from the hallway. The specimen was an oxygen-reactive fungal culture that could grow explosively in the right conditions. If it reached her, its microscopic spores could cause severe respiratory damage. "Help," she called, knowing it was futile. The night shift was minimal, and the emergency protocols would have sealed off the entire section. Nari climbed onto her desk to reach the emergency supply cabinet. Inside was a breathing mask, but it was designed for larger species and would never seal properly around her small face. She tried anyway, pressing it against her mouth as the green mist began to fill the lower part of the lab. A loud bang startled her. Someone was at the observation window in the hallway. Through the spreading mist, she saw a large figure, Diplomat Kim. He was wearing an emergency breather mask and pointing urgently at the door controls on her side. "The manual override," he shouted, his voice muffled by the mask and the thick door. Press the red and blue buttons simultaneously. Nari jumped down, careful to stay on her desk above the gathering mist. She stretched to reach the control panel, but it was mounted for taller species. Even standing on tiptoe, she couldn't quite reach the top buttons. Outside, Kim was working on the hall controls, but the emergency lockdown had disabled them. He disappeared from the window briefly, then returned with what looked like a maintenance tool. He began prying at the door mechanism. The mist was rising faster now. Nari could feel her lungs burning as trace amounts leaked through her ill-fitting mask. Her vision began to blur at the edges. With a desperate leap, she managed to hit the manual override buttons, but landed in the mist. She coughed violently as the spores entered her lungs. The door slid open a few inches before jamming. Kim's large hands appeared in the gap, pushing with tremendous force. Metal groaned as he forced the door open wide enough to enter. Without hesitation, he waded through the knee-high mist, lifted Nari in his arms, and carried her out. In the hallway, he sealed his mask over her face despite her weak protests. "Deep breaths," he instructed, moving quickly toward the emergency decontamination chamber at the end of the corridor. Inside the chamber, automated systems activated, spraying them both with a fine mist of neutralizing agent. Kim set Nari down carefully on a bench, but kept a steadying hand on her shoulder as she coughed and gasped. "Medical team is on the way," he said. "Just breathe slowly." When Nari could finally speak, she looked up at Kim with newfound confusion. "Why were you here?" "It's the middle of night cycle. I was checking on a culture sample in xenobiology," he explained. "I heard the alarm and was evacuating when I realized you might still be in your lab. You often work late." "You noticed my schedule?" Nari asked suspiciously, old fears resurfacing despite his heroic actions. Kim's expression changed to one Nari had not seen before. He looked hurt. "Of course I noticed. We're colleagues. When someone almost always skips meal periods and works through rest cycles, it's hard not to notice." The medical team arrived before Nari could respond. They quickly examined her, administered a medication to counteract the fungal spores, and insisted both she and Kim be taken to the medical bay for observation. Later, lying in adjacent beds in the medical bay, an uncomfortable silence hung between them. Nari studied Kim surreptitiously. He had risked his life to save hers without hesitation. According to the briefing, humans did sometimes perform heroic acts to impress potential mates, but there had been no audience, no one to impress. "Thank you," she finally said. "You saved my life." Kim turned to look at her. Anyone would have done the same. "No." Nari shook her head. "Most would have followed evacuation protocols. You broke them. I couldn't leave you there," he said simply. Nari took a deep breath. The medication was making her lightheaded, reducing her usual caution. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Have you been pursuing me as a mate?" The words tumbled out before she could reconsider. Kim's eyes widened, and then, to Nari's surprise, he began to laugh. Not mockingly, but with genuine amusement that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Is that why you've been so uncomfortable around me?" he asked when he could speak again. "You thought I was trying to court you." Nari's blue skin darkened with embarrassment. The briefing said humans form quick attachments and use eye contact as a mating signal. "You kept looking at me and bringing me drinks and helping me reach things." Kim's expression softened. "Dr. Nari, humans look at people when we talk to them. It's basic politeness. And I brought you coffee because I bring coffee to all my colleagues. As for the reaching, you're 3 feet tall in a lab designed for taller species. It seemed practical to help. So you haven't been—" Nari couldn't finish the sentence. "Trying to mate with you." Kim shook his head. "Humans don't generally pursue romantic relationships outside our species. And even among humans, we don't just pounce on people we've just met." Relief washed over Nari, followed by a wave of embarrassment. "I've been misinterpreting everything." Cultural misunderstandings happen, Kim said gently. That's why we're on this mission, to learn about each other. Maybe we can start over. The medical chief entered before Nari could respond. Good news. You'll both make a full recovery. No permanent damage from the spore exposure. After the doctor left, Nari looked at Kim with new eyes. I would like to start over, she said. And perhaps you could explain actual human social customs to me. The briefing was clearly misleading. I'd be happy to, Kim smiled. And maybe you could tell me more about Mesonian customs. I've probably been making just as many mistakes without realizing it. For the first time since Kim had arrived on the ship, Nari felt her fear dissolving. Perhaps humans weren't the frightening, mate-obsessed giants she had feared. Perhaps they were just people. Different, yes, but understandable. I think, she said cautiously, this might be the beginning of a successful scientific collaboration. The recreation lounge of the Cosmic Inquiry had become Nari and Kim's unofficial meeting place during the evening rest cycle. 2 weeks had passed since the lab incident, and their conversations had evolved from cautious exchanges about work to genuine cultural discussions. Tonight, they sat at a small table near the viewport, stars streaming by as the ship continued its research mission. So humans touch shoulders as a friendly gesture? Nari asked, making notes on her datapad. She had begun compiling a guide to human behaviors for her fellow Mesonians. Kim nodded. A light touch on the shoulder or upper arm usually indicates camaraderie or emphasis in conversation. It's not romantic or aggressive. And the coffee ritual? Just hospitality, Kim explained. Sharing food or drinks is a way humans build social bonds with friends and colleagues. No mating intentions involved. Nari's antennae twitched with embarrassment. Our cultural briefing got so much wrong. I'm curious what it actually said about us, Kim said, leaning forward. The human briefing on Mesonians was mostly technical information about your physiology and scientific achievements. Very little about social customs. Nari hesitated, then handed him her datapad. See for yourself. It's quite dramatic. Kim's eyes widened as he read. Humans may interpret any friendly gesture as romantic interest. They form attachments quickly and pursue potential mates aggressively. They often use their size to intimidate smaller species. He looked up. No wonder you were terrified of me. The warning seemed very official, Nari said defensively. Who wrote this? Kim asked, continuing to scroll through the document. It's compiled from various sources, some academic studies, some personal accounts from other species who've encountered humans. Nari pointed to a notation. This section comes from Zolaxian diplomatic records. Kim chuckled. Ah, that explains it. Zolaxians reproduce through elaborate public courtship rituals. They probably misinterpreted ordinary human friendliness as mating behavior. A small group of crew members entered the lounge, including Dr. Mino and Lieutenant Dury from ship operations. They nodded politely at Nari and Kim before selecting a table across the room. They're still not comfortable with me, Kim observed quietly. They're curious but cautious, Nari replied. Most of the crew read the same briefing I did, but give them time. I'm sharing what I've learned. Speaking of learning, Kim said, you promised to explain Mesonian greeting customs. I'm pretty sure I've been doing them wrong. Nari demonstrated the proper palm-to-chest gesture. The pressure should be light, and the duration brief. Holding it too long signals distress or submission. Kim practiced the movement several times. Like this. Better, Nari encouraged. Our gestures are subtle because our ancestors needed to communicate without alerting predators. That makes sense given your planet's ecology, Kim said. Humans evolved as pursuit predators ourselves, so our gestures tend to be more obvious and energetic. Across the room, Mino and Dury whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at Nari and Kim. They're talking about us, aren't they? Kim asked. Nari's antennae twitched in amusement. They think we've developed a romantic relationship. Kim nearly choked on his drink. What? Why would they think that? We spend a lot of time together, and I'm no longer running away from you in terror, Neri explained. By Mesonian standards, that's suspicious behavior. Kim laughed. Should we correct them? I tried, but Mino says I'm in denial. Apparently, my detailed questions about human social customs seem very personal to other Mesonians. Their conversation was interrupted by the ship's computer. Attention all research personnel. Approaching solar anomaly in Sector 5. Observation posts are now active. That's my cue, Kim said, standing. I'm scheduled for the first observation shift. Actually, Neri said, rising as well, I thought I might join you. The anomaly's radiation patterns could affect communication wavelengths. They walked together to the observation deck, unaware of the speculative glances from the crew they passed. The observation room was empty when they arrived, its large windows offering a spectacular view of the approaching stellar phenomenon. A rare type of pulsar with unusual energy signatures. Kim adjusted the sensors while Neri calibrated the recording equipment. They worked in comfortable silence, their movements now coordinated after weeks of collaboration. It's beautiful, Neri said as the pulsar came into view, its blue-white light pulsing rhythmically. It is, Kim agreed. Though not as beautiful as Earth's oceans. Have you ever seen images of Earth? Only in scientific contexts, Neri admitted. What are the oceans like? Kim described the vast waters of his homeworld, his face animated with enthusiasm. Neri found herself watching his expressions as much as listening to his words. On my world, she said when he finished, your size would make you a valuable protector, not something to fear. Large Mesonians have always been respected for their ability to watch for predators. Really? So being tall is admired? Very much so. Our leaders tend to be the tallest among us. Captain Tai is quite impressive by our standards. That explains why he always stands so straight when we have meetings, Kim observed. Neri nodded. Height signifies security and leadership potential. It's deeply ingrained in our culture. So you were not only afraid I was pursuing you, Kim said slowly, but you were dealing with someone who represented an authority figure in your cultural context. I hadn't thought of it that way, Neri said, her antennae perking up with interest. But yes, your height would subconsciously trigger respect responses. The pulsar flashed more intensely, bathing the observation room in waves of blue light. Kim adjusted the window filters to protect their eyes. In human culture, he said, your size might make people want to protect you, but it wouldn't diminish their respect for your abilities. Really, smaller humans aren't considered vulnerable. Some might make that assumption initially, Kim admitted, but it generally doesn't last once they see what you can do. Size is just one physical trait among many. As they continued their conversation, Commander J entered the observation deck. He paused when he saw them, his antennae twitching curiously. Dr. Neri, Diplomat Kim, I didn't expect to find you both here. We're recording the pulsar's effects on communication wavelengths, Neri explained quickly. The commander looked between them, his expression unreadable to Kim, but clearly skeptical to Neri. I see. Carry on with your research. After he left, Kim turned to Neri. What was that about? Neri's blue skin darkened with embarrassment. He thinks we're using scientific research as an excuse to be alone together. The rumors are getting out of hand, Kim said, frowning. Should we address this formally? Actually, Neri said thoughtfully, perhaps we can use this misunderstanding. The crew is curious about us. We could organize a cultural exchange session, explain human and Mesonian social customs to everyone. That's brilliant, Kim agreed. It would clear up the confusion and advance the mission's goals at the same time. As they turned back to observe the pulsar, Neri realized how far she had come. The human she had once dreaded was now her closest colleague on the ship. More than that, he was becoming a friend. She had been so wrong about humans, and she was determined to help others see past their misconceptions too. The lights in the main conference room dimmed as Neri activated her presentation display. A holographic map of known space appeared, highlighting the territories of both human and Mesonian civilizations. After weeks of preparation, today was the final briefing before the Cosmic Inquiry completed its mission and returned to Mesonian space. Captain Taz stood at the front of the room. As we approach the conclusion of our joint research expedition, Dr. Neri will present her findings on interspecies communication and cultural exchange. Neri looked out at the assembled crew. In the front row sat Diplomat Kim, his tall frame dwarfing the Mesonian-sized chair. He gave her an encouraging nod. 3 months ago, that same gesture would have sent her hiding behind her workstation. Now, it calmed her nerves. "Thank you, Captain," Neri began. "My report today covers not only our scientific findings, but also our progress in Mesonian human cultural understanding." She advanced to the first slide, which showed the original cultural briefing document about humans. Several crew members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "We began this mission with serious misconceptions about our human colleagues," Neri continued. "Our briefings described humans as aggressive, constantly seeking mates, and potentially dangerous due to their size." A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience. Mino, sitting near the back, flicked his antennae in embarrassment. "These misconceptions led to unnecessary fear and hindered our early collaboration," Neri said. "Through direct experience, we have learned that humans are not the mating-obsessed giants we feared." Kim smiled good-naturedly as several crew members glanced his way. Neri advanced to the next slide, displaying her revised cultural guide. Humans use direct eye contact as a sign of attention and respect, not as a mating signal. Their offers of assistance are cooperative gestures, not dominance displays. And most importantly, they do not form inappropriate attachments to other species. The presentation continued as Neri explained human social customs, communication styles, and collaborative approaches. She had worked hard to make the information accurate and practical. "In conclusion," she said, "I have submitted this revised cultural guide to the Mesonian Science Academy. It will replace the previous briefing for all future joint missions." Captain Taz stepped forward again. "Thank you, Dr. Neri. And now, Diplomat Kim will share the human perspective on our collaboration." Kim rose and took Neri's place at the presentation console. His slides showed a similar revision to the human briefing on Mesonians. "Like Dr. Neri, I have prepared updated cultural guidelines for human diplomats and scientists," he explained. "Our previous understanding of Mesonians focused almost exclusively on your scientific achievements, with little attention to social customs." Kim displayed a list of revised observations. "We now understand that Mesonian communication relies heavily on subtle antenna movements, that your society values height as a sign of leadership, and that your natural caution stems from your evolutionary history as prey species." Neri watched with pride as Kim continued his presentation. They had spent many evening cycles working on these materials together, each teaching the other about their respective cultures. "Perhaps most importantly," Kim said, "we've learned that effective collaboration between our species requires patience and direct communication. What humans may interpret as excessive caution, Mesonians see as proper risk assessment. What Mesonians might see as reckless behavior, humans view as necessary initiative." After both presentations concluded, Captain Tai announced a surprising development. The Mesonian Science Council has requested Diplomat Kim serve as the first human cultural ambassador to our homeworld. This unprecedented invitation offers an opportunity to deepen the relationship between our species. Murmurs of approval spread through the room. Kim looked genuinely moved by the announcement. "I am honored to accept," he said, "and I would like to request that Dr. Neri serve as my liaison, if she is willing." All eyes turned to Neri. Her antennae quivered with surprise and pleasure. "I would be honored," she replied. Later, as the crew dispersed to prepare for the final leg of their journey home, Neri and Kim stood in the observation lounge, watching the stars. "From dreading you to introducing you to my species," Neri mused. "Quite the journey. The best diplomatic stories always begin with misunderstandings." Kim replied with a smile. I still can't believe how wrong I was, Neri said, shaking her head. I was convinced you were pursuing me romantically. Kim chuckled. Well, your revised cultural guide should prevent other Mizonians from making the same mistake. Though I'm curious, what would a human actually have to do to court a Mizonian properly? Neri's antennae shot straight up in surprise. That's a very specific question. Purely academic, Kim assured her, though his smile suggested otherwise. For the cultural guide, of course. Of course, Neri replied, her blue skin darkening slightly. Well, traditionally, a potential mate would demonstrate their value through problem-solving abilities and resource management. Size and strength are admired, but intelligence is considered most attractive. Interesting, Kim said thoughtfully. Humans often start with shared meals and conversations to establish compatibility. We do have some similarities then, Neri observed. Both approaches focus on demonstrating suitability as a long-term partner. They fell silent, watching as the ship adjusted its course, the stars shifting in the viewport. The Science Council will have many questions for you, Neri said finally. Are you prepared to be the first human many Mizonians have ever met? With you as my guide, I'm not worried, Kim replied. Though I might need help with the food. What was that dish you mentioned? Glazed root vegetables with protein crystals. Taro mash, Neri said. It's a traditional welcome meal. You might actually enjoy it. I look forward to trying it, Kim said sincerely. The ship's computer announced the final preparations for the jump to Mizonian space. Crew members hurried past them in the corridor, securing equipment and checking systems. We should help with preparations, Neri said, though she made no move to leave. In a moment, Kim replied. I just want to say, I'm glad you were assigned as my liaison, despite your initial fears. So am I, Neri admitted, though perhaps don't mention to the Science Council that I once thought you were trying to mate with me. Kim laughed. That can be our secret. As they walked together toward the bridge, Neri reflected on how completely her understanding had changed. The human she once feared was now her trusted colleague and friend. She had learned that true communication went beyond words and gestures. It required openness to new perspectives and the courage to question one's assumptions. The Cosmic Inquiry prepared for its final jump, carrying not just scientific data, but a new foundation for understanding between two very different species. And it had all begun with one small alien's misplaced fears about a friendly human's intentions.